you are going to love the guest that we have today. Jim Tabuchi is somebody that's been a very important person in my life for a very long period of time. Jim Tabuchi is a mentor. He has an incredible amount of life experience that he's going to share with us today, and things that are pretty much going to blow your mind. He is a serial social entrepreneur, and he's going to get into what this means. He's been called the Swiss Army knife, and this is a gentleman who retired from Hewlett-Packard when he was 42 years old because he wanted to make an impact in the world. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it. And by the way, today is my 32nd anniversary. So, yeah, it's just a wonder to get to this point and to celebrate our lives together with Joanne.
Well, it's fantastic. Yeah. Congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have lived a really remarkable life, and it starts a really long time ago. I wanted to take the listeners through the real adventure of your life, because it is really something with a bunch of high highs and interesting kinds of lows. And so one thing that I know about you is many, many years ago, I took a motorcycle trip out to a place out of Delta, Utah called Camp Topaz, and it was a Japanese internment camp. And I published a few pictures on Facebook of driving out into this nothingness space where Japanese people had been interned in World War II, and you spoke up and started sharing some of your story. And so can you speak for a little bit about your family's connection to the Japanese internment in World War II?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Yeah. Coincidentally, Topaz is where my father-in-law and his family spent their time. So there were a number of camps across the U.S. That was not the camp that my family was at. My mother's side of the family was at Tule Lake, which is in the northeast corner of California. And then I don't know why, but my father's family was sent all the way to Rower, Arkansas, which is a couple hours outside of Little Rock. So just imagine that, right? World War II breaks out. My mother was 11 years old. My father was right around 15 years old. So they were preteen or teens at the time. Terrible time in their lives. If you look at my father's side of the family, they were, you could probably say that they were upper middle class. My grandfather had started a business in Stockton, California. It's called Tabuchi's Department Store. They were actually very affluent. I have the physical tax returns from the mid 1930s from the Tabuchi Department Store. And one of the tax returns said that they reported net income of about $8,000, right? So this is just to kind of set the stage. $8,000 in, just kind of post-depression era of net income was a lot of money, right? You could buy a brand new custom house for about $5,000 at the time. You could buy a brand new car for maybe, $500 to $700. So what that meant is that they were very wealthy.
And this is the middle of the Depression too. They were doing very well.
Yeah, it was after the Depression. They were doing very well. They owned their building that they lived in. In fact, Alex Spanos was and his family were tenants in our Tabuchi building, right? So Alex Spanos, went on to become a billionaire and own the Chargers, right? Well, they were our first tenant in the building, right? So you go forward, right? They were very wealthy, owned their own home, worked really hard, and then World War II came about. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941. At that point, the Tabuchi family and the Nakao family, my mom's side, knew that things were going to change really drastically for them. They went forward. They had to sell all of the goods in the department store within about a week. So it was basically a fire sale, very, very demoralizing to them. having to close the business, vacate the house, move into a relocation center, which was like a half mile from their house. So they had to, board everything up, put everything in storage, and basically walk over to be imprisoned at that point. So they had everything taken away, the store, the livelihood, their possessions, ultimately their freedom, and then go into this internment camp, which was at the county fairgrounds. It was just, horrible injustice to them. And yet, my grandfather sat my father down in camp in Arkansas and told my father, he said, wars only last for 3 years, right? How did my grandfather know that? but he told my father, he said, wars only last for 3 years. So get ready, right? We're going to get out of this camp. We're going to build back the business even better than it was before, right? So even having all of those things taken away and ultimately the freedom, my grandfather stayed optimistic, even when guns are pointing at him and he's in barbed wire within this horrible concentration camp that was there. Fast forward, they did get out. The war lasted 3 years, amazingly, right? They got out. My father was one of the first ones that came back to the College of Pacific and enrolled in business school there. My grandparents came out after that. My grandfather was able to get his family back into the family home, but within about 3 months, he got very, very sick, vomiting blood, losing blood and all that. And they determined that he had cancer, right? And he ultimately died from that about 3 months after leaving camp. But he accomplished his goal, which was to get the family back into their home. Yeah. So that was my father's side. My mother's side was also in camp. On my mother's side, I should also mention that my mother's older sister was in Japan during World War II. So she was what's called a kibe, which means that she was sent back to live with her grandmother in Japan and to study and to work there. So my aunt she was about, I think she was 16 years old, and was a nurse's aide. And it turned out that our family lived in Hiroshima. And so my aunt was a nurse's aide on the morning of the dropping of the atomic bomb. And it just happened that she was in an office down in the basement. And when the bomb went off, she was shielded by the bomb. She got hit by a filing cabinet, so that's how close she was to the epicenter. But managed to get out of that hospital, but saw all the devastation of the atomic bomb, and she was ordered to go take refuge in a cave. While she was on the path to get to that cave, she noticed that there was this sick girl in front of her. She picked her up, and that girl ended up dying in her arms on the way to the cave. So being a nurse's aide, she was told to go to the hospital. She had to take care of the sick and the dying and to comfort them. And just the horror of World War II was right in front of her eyes. And she never really fully recovered from that. So again, you look back to World War II, that's where I get my strength, right? That my family had to endure so much injustice, so much imprisonment, so much of the war and the tragedy of the war, that when I look at my life today, they paved my life for me, providing me with all of these opportunities. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing that could happen to me that would be worse than what my ancestors had gone through in the war. And so, to me, I look at that and that gives me a lot of courage, a lot of strength to say I can take risks, and that means that I can take on these endeavors to help others, and no matter what the setback is with me, there's no way it can be worse than what my family went through. So that's the basis for my strength.
I can't help myself when you're explaining these things. I can see them in my head. Like you have this way of being able to explain what your family went through that's very moving. I imagine that some of that comes from the number of stories that have been passed down about those times in your family that are very well known in your family, these traumas, these injustices and everything like that.
Yeah, yeah. Although, not a lot was said. There's very few words that were actually talked about, right? I really had to kind of grab onto these stories and pull them out of people, right? Pull them out of my father, pull it out of my aunt, and and really ask for these stories to be written down, because that's the only way we know. But now that I know the story, it's my obligation to pass it down to my kids and my nieces and nephews, to the next generation.
No, it's tremendously important. My experience in going to Camp Topaz, it's out of this little tiny place called Delta, Utah.
Right.
And I'd passed it a couple of times and I wanted to make time to go out, but I've been to concentration camps in other places in the world, and they are very thoughtfully maintained and incredible places to stand and be. Camp
Yeah,
Topaz, there was nothing there. There were no signs
exactly.
to get there. I had to get a map and follow it and get there. There's a tiny plaque there with a little American flag, and there's ruins on the ground.
Yeah.
Teapots and car doors and things like that. Nothing standing out there. Nothing maintained. I was really taken aback
Hmm.
by
Hmm.
the kind of moving on from history. This is a very important piece of history.
Yeah, yeah. If you think about it, right, the U.S. government created these camps very quickly, right, and put them in place. But I think that the government knew that this was a disgrace. This was the wrong thing to do, and so once the camps were closed, they did everything possible to scrape the earth of this. And so you can imagine, one or two generations, there's going to be nothing there unless there's memories that are put in place in written form. Yeah, they literally scraped the land. There were 18,000 people in Tule Lake, and if you go there today, you don't even know that it existed. It's obliterated from kind of the cultural memory of the country.
Well, I'm really glad that you are willing to talk about it here, because I know that it's the source of a lot of shame and pain for the people who endured it. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, yeah, there's a lot of shame and pain that came from it. But if you can kind of flip it around, right, and to use that as a source of pride for having survived it, but then also thriving and using that as a source of strength, I think that's probably the most positive thing that can come out of this.
So when were you born?
I was born in '63, so I
Okay.
just I just celebrated my 60th birthday
Yeah,
last week.
happy
Yeah,
birthday.
thank you, thank you. Yeah.
And so 1963, you have
Mhm.
brothers and sisters?
Yeah, yeah, I'm the youngest one, so my mom still calls me the baby. My 93-year-old mom. Yeah.
And so you're in this family that has
Mhm.
had to rebuild from the ground up,
Mhm.
that has a mindset of understanding what real suffering actually is, and you start thinking some higher thoughts about what is possible in the world, and you're starting to kind of grow up, and you where did your mindset that you have now really begin to kind of start? Where did that all come from?
Yeah, yeah. That's a great question. I was one of these people who had, I don't know, I knew where I was going. right? I remember back when I was 5 years old, my grandmother asking me what college I was going to go to, right? I mean, who does that? Right? So I knew, college was my destiny. When I came out of high school, I applied to one college. It's crazy thinking about it now, right? Kids these days, they'll apply to 30 colleges. I applied to one, and it was to go to
Jeez.
UC Berkeley, right? And by the way, I didn't get in. so, so I applied. I had 4.0 GPA. I had high SAT scores and all that. But I didn't realize I applied to one of the most popular universities in the most impacted major. So I applied into electrical engineering, which electrical engineering, computer science, and so they had thousands and thousands of people applying to this major. I just figured, I had decent test scores and all that, I was going to get in. So I only applied to one college. They denied me, and I had to get accepted on appeal for that. But I knew, when I got into electrical engineering, I knew that's what I wanted to do. But then once I started electrical engineering, I knew my path, my career path, which was to take a technical background. I had business going through my veins from the Tabuchi side. I knew I wanted to combine business and electrical engineering, high tech work. And then I had a very strong interest in international business. And so I studied Japanese language, and I knew that I was going to get my MBA right after that. So graduated with an electrical engineering degree, went and got my MBA in international marketing, went overseas, studied and worked in Japan, went to Hewlett-Packard after that, right? And so started my career that way. But during that time, focused everything on international business in the high-tech world. And it turned out that was a great career choice. So it's kind of interesting. My life has been a series of 18-year cycles. So my education was 18 years, starting from kindergarten through to get my undergraduate and graduate degree, right? That was my first 18 years. I then went into the high-tech world and spent 18 years in that. So everything was about international business in the high-tech side. Worked overseas in Japan, worked overseas in Hong Kong as the Asia Pacific region manager. So was exposed to a dozen countries in really the very start of the heyday. So visited Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, India, Australia, just traveled on a weekly basis, most weeks covering about 3 countries every week. So was living out of suitcase, visiting, hotels in different countries and all that, which really propelled my career. There were a lot of electrical engineers in high tech, of course. There were some who had MBAs, but nobody had international experience together with business and with high tech. And so that became the foundation. I called it the 3-legged stool for my career. And it allowed me to propel my career very, very quickly up into senior management within Hewlett-Packard. And to that end, one of the managers that I had met in Korea, actually, his Korean sales manager, turned me on to this book called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, right? And so he gave me the book, and during my travels, I read the book and took all of the exercises very seriously. And one of the exercises was to imagine your own funeral and what it would be like, and what are people saying about you at your own funeral, right? And that exercise took me probably about 4 months to go through, to actually seriously imagine myself sitting at my own funeral and what's being said. That was a life-changing exercise for me, right? Because up until then, I was such a hard-charging business person. I was spending literally 90, 100 hours a week just focused on my career, right? And by the way, at the time I had, twin boys, newborns, and my wife, and we all had traveled to Hong Kong. Well, I was working the Asia Pacific day at that time. At the same time, I was working probably 4 to 6 hours in the middle of the night, communicating back with my California division, right? So that exercise really caused me to stop and think, right? Which is what's my life about? What's it all about? What's the meaning of life, and what's the purpose of my life? And so through that Stephen Covey exercise, I realized that all of these things about meeting quota, getting paychecks and raises and new positions and all of that, it's all pretty superficial, right? In reality, what my life is meant to be about is having a positive impact on everybody that I encounter, right? And so that became my life mission, right? And I know that at my deathbed, I'm not going to worry about hitting 130% of quota in Q3 of 2003, right? That doesn't matter, right? What really matters are the lives that I've touched, the people that I've impacted positively, and making that difference, right? And so that became my life mission after that.
So that kind of goes into, it sounds like you're 42 years old, you decide that it's time to retire. You've gone to the top of your division in Hewlett-Packard. You're there and you're infused with this kind of sense of this existential need for more meaning out of the
Right.
work that you do and the way that you spend the hours of your week. And so at this point, do you know what you're going to do next?
No. Nope. It was really interesting. As I was in Hewlett-Packard, right? I was highly technical to begin with, but then my managers, for some reason, saw this insight that I could have a bigger impact managing and leading people. I went kicking and screaming. I wanted to stay technical. But what I didn't realize was how fun it would be and how fulfilling it would be to coach people, right? And to mentor them. And so I started taking on mentorships of people. And the best thing about it was I always viewed that about 50% of my reward in the job was the paycheck that I got. The other 50% was the fulfillment that I got in helping other people succeed. And so that's what I started doing. And little did I know that would also propel me to higher levels within the corporation, to the point where I got to be senior manager at a pretty young age, and people still saw promise that I was going to be VP, executive VP. Who knows how far I would go within the corporate chain. And I stepped away from that, and people couldn't believe it. They're like, you were in line to become the next general manager, next VP, executive VP, and yet you turned that down, and you're retiring early, right? My boss once told me, he said, Jim, you're really hard to manage. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm like, I hit my objectives, run a really good team. We have 300-400 people on my team, and almost no attrition from my team. And he said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. He said, I could threaten to fire you and you wouldn't care, right? And I said, yeah, that's right. I said, financially, I could leave this job right now and I could care less, right? I have what I need to live for the rest of my life. And so, I'm financially independent, right? So it's funny, after that, all of our one-on-ones that we talked about were about him achieving financial independence. So um, so yeah, I was able to jump away from the high tech world, and I knew that my life would be about helping people. I just didn't know in what direction. And so I have these metaphors that I use that um, that people can either be an arrow or they can be a feather, right? An arrow, if you think about it, you take this arrow, it's sharpened arrow, and you have a target, right? This concentric circles on this target. You aim that arrow and you try to shoot it as straight as possible, right for the dead center of that target, right? You know what your goal is, you know how you're going to achieve it, and you just shoot for it, right? The flip side, though, is a feather. And if you're familiar with the story of Forrest Gump, right? There's this white feather that just kind of follows along where the wind blows, right?
Right.
And Forrest Gump, that was his life. He had no idea that he was, going to go into the military, or that he was going to be this, football, college football star, or a ping pong star in China, or whatever it was, right? He just let the wind take him where it was going to go. So if you think about the first part of my life, I was that straight arrow, shooting to be an amazing international businessman in the high-tech world. And I achieved it, right? The second, phase of my professional life, though, has really been as a feather, right? I go to where the wind takes me. So what that means is that opportunities present themselves, and when I get those phone calls, most of the time I'll say yes to what they are. And what that's led me to is just a huge amount of opportunities to help people that I had no idea that were going to come into my life. And so, yeah, today I'm that Forrest Gump white feather that's kind of floating around according to where the wind is taking me.
And so you have this knack for knowing the strengths of people and understanding very subtly their weaknesses as well. And throughout the years, you when I've spoken with you, you've so kindly pushed me into doing things that I wasn't thinking that I needed to do, but you course correct in a very gentle way. And it's always based upon values. What are the values you're going here? What's the foundational good that you're trying to do here? Let's start with that. And so you've obviously been able to come to, and it sounds like that you got really good at it at Hewlett-Packard, the ability to recognize people's patterns, those with potential, those with various weaknesses that they either know about or don't know about. How did you come to just be able to read people like that, know those who have the X factor, I guess, the kind of it, and those that need to hear a certain thing that can course correct them? Where did that all come from?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I know that my mind synthesizes things in ways that I don't think anybody that I've met synthesizes in this same way. So what I mean by that is I can take in a huge amount of data, and from that gain some pretty unique insights. I used to do this from a strategy standpoint, within my career. I would take customer reports, and I would take bug reports and industry information, typically like a foot of material, and I'd go off to a library and a coffee shop and wander around at a college, or just get into some deep thinking, and from that come up with a strategy, and a really sound strategy of how we can take our organization forward. I don't know where that comes from, but my mind is able to just synthesize a lot of things and kind of put it into the computer, and then come out with some very simple strategies. I also do that with people, right? So a lot of it's just through observation, through listening, through understanding their environment, seeing the world from their eyes, and uncovering what could be really breakthrough opportunities for them. I'll give you an example, right? I had an engineer in Singapore who had who came to me, who was very, very troubled, was getting ready to quit the company, didn't know what he was going to do with his life, and was really just kind of distraught at that point. And I listened to him for a while, and I said, you know, I don't get it, right? You're in a perfect position now, where you're in Singapore, developing country. The government has already said that they want to go in the high tech area that we're in. All you have to do is to assert yourself into that area, and you can be an amazing resource for yourself, but also for the overall, country. He came back a month later and he said, Jim, he said, I'm now having dinner with the director of economic development for the country of Singapore. And I'm now part of the strategic initiative for where the country is going. And he said, it's all because of what you talked with me about. And he said, now my career is on a whole different trajectory, and I see the importance of what I'm doing, right? and so yeah, so a lot of it is just that ability to synthesize, and maybe to see some things that others don't, from a very high level perspective. I created this program called the Catalyst Leadership Development Program, where we take high potential leaders and really help to turn them into true leaders, right? Super fortunate to have this program, under my wings, where all these people, I viewed them as these big jumbo 747s on the runway, getting ready to take off, right? And the gift to me was that I had now had this classroom full of these 747s who had they were wonderful people, already employed, having gone through their education, and were identified as being these high potential leaders, right? So I looked at them as these 747s who'd been developed, designed, equipped, manufactured, fully fueled up, ready on this runway, ready to take off. I just had to figure out how to release the brake. And once that happens, all of these high potential leaders then can take off and soar. And so I'm seeing it today, kind of the fruits of that labor, where they're now CEOs, chief financial officers, general counsel, all of these just amazing individuals who are now leading. And all I had to do was to figure out how to release that brake with them. And now they go and soar. So that's a lot of what I do today.
Well, so in your work that you've done with me, I come to you and I explain a big idea, and I'm usually already down on the other end of the football field at the 30-yard line. You're still standing at the other end zone, and you go, okay, well, let's start with step one in this whole, how did you start down this road? And you always pull back to a center that is mission focused, is values focused. And I'm assuming that comes from some just base level of wisdom, some spiritual background or something like that you really are in tune with. So where does that kind of come from?
That's a great question. I actually don't know. Although I have a deep-seated understanding that your values should not change. To me, I view that I'm one person, right? How I'm speaking with you on this podcast is exactly how I would speak to my 93-year-old mother, or to my kids, or to my wife, or anybody that I'm coaching. That I don't believe in masks, right? A lot of people, when you think about when they're going to work, right? They wake up, they look at themselves in the mirror, they brush their teeth, get ready for work and all that. They put on whatever their uniform is for that day. They get in the car, they're grabbing that steering wheel as they're driving to work, and they're putting on a mask. They're putting on successive masks to where they get into work, and now they've got this mask on that's completely different from how they were at home. Meanwhile, when it's time to go home from work, they then take off those masks, right? I don't believe in that. right? I just believe in being who I am. Um, I got that feeling actually pretty early on in life. I remember being, I think it was like fifth grade, right? You start to, you know, learn cuss words and things like that when you're in elementary school, and you start to, use those words when you're there and all that. And I knew it's like, if I ever use those words at home, right, my parents would kill me, right? Not literally, but I mean, I'd be in bad trouble. So I figured, like, why should I use different words when I'm at school than when I'm at home? That's too difficult to do. I'm just going to be the same person as I am at school as I am at work or at home, right? And this is in fifth grade, I came to that realization. And so therefore, after that, it's like, yeah, just be the same person. It's a whole lot easier to do that. But then, as part of that, the same person means that you're really based on a set of values that you have. And those values just became developed over time, and what worked for me, right?
Yeah. Meanwhile, at the same time in my life, I was learning that I really preferred the taste of Dove soap over Irish Spring
Yeah.
because I ended up having a lot of it in my mouth.
Yeah, yeah. So I just avoided that, right?
Yeah.
There was another thing that I avoided, and that had to do with um, drinking alcohol, right? And I don't fault anybody, who chooses to drink. It's just that when I was 10 years old, very, very vivid memory for me. I was 10 years old, and I was washing sidewalks at my father's store. So we had a bunch of pigeon poop and all of that we had to wash off. And so I remember, taking out the hose and all that, and I had to wash off the sidewalk. Well, there were homeless people that were sleeping on the sidewalk. And so in order for me to do my job, I had to speak with them and talk with them and ask them very politely to move so that I could do my job, right? And the story that just kept coming up over and over and over again, where these people were homeless, and they lost their wives and families and kids and house and all of that because of drinking. And so I just chose at that point, yeah, it's like, I don't need to drink. Fast forward, I lived in wine country, right, for 16 years. Kind of a tough place to be without being a drinker. But some of these things, they were just, very early lessons in life. I remember being about 16 years old, and I had a job at, Tabuchi's department store and all that. And I remember that I had, with the money that I had bought this cool little boom box, right? Uh, and I think it cost like $100. And I was so happy, and I was showing it off to all my friends in the drum corps and all that I had this little boom box, and I got a lot of pleasure from it. And I was really happy to own that. And then I stopped and I was like, this isn't right. Why am I so happy because I bought something? If I gain happiness from purchasing something, then something's wrong in my life. And so I thought, I shouldn't derive happiness from buying something ever, right? And so that's where, material things just became, you know, non-consequential to me. It's just like, I don't care about material things, right? They don't mean anything to me. And I don't get enjoyment out of material things. And so what that meant to me is that I didn't have to rely on money to make me happy. Again, very early lessons in life. Yeah.
Well, probably a big reason why you were financially stable enough at 42 years old to make a major change for yourself is that you had been very mindful of the blessing of money
Mm-hmm.
and the careful way that money can create good in the world and can
Yeah.
create stability early in life if you are careful with it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So to me, money didn't mean possessions or happiness. Money meant freedom. Yeah. And I stopped thinking about money in terms of dollars, and I started thinking about money in terms of time. And the whole idea is, with the amount of wealth that I have, if I were to receive no more money in life, meaning I lost my job and no money was coming in, how long could I live on my current wealth, given my current lifestyle, right? And so I started thinking about my wealth in terms of months, right? If you have 1 month's worth of expenses in your wealth, then that means you can live a month, right? But as you start to save and invest, then your wealth starts to build up, and at some point, it's like, I don't need to work anymore, and that's true freedom, right? And once you have that freedom, then you're free to do whatever you want at that point.
And that's actually something that I do, that my wife and I does. We've got this program where we essentially program in all of our expenses, all of our income, and it shows you how far you have without income to be okay.
Yeah, right.
And when you can grow that period of time, there's this strong sense of strength, freedom, and that all of that sort of thing that comes along with the financial freedom. So
yes, yeah.
And then you get to make a decision like you did when you were 42. So since you've been 42, you had 18 years since that time. You've done a lot of different things, and all of these things have been helping people build themselves, both in organizations and one-on-one with people. And so what you are done with your career at 42, that part of your career, and you move into new things. What are the values that you use to decide where you need to be?
So it's all about helping people. I've chosen to do a lot of helping of people, typically young adults, right? And here's the reason why. If you help somebody who's, let's say, 20 years old, right, and that person can live to be 80 plus years old, then that means you've had an impact on them for the next 60 years. And not only have you helped them, but you've probably helped the next generation and the next generation after that, right? And and so that's been a real area of focus for me, is to help young adults. And so that's been in the Drum and Bugle Corps that I've been part of and helped to grow. That's been in the Catalyst program, where it's really high potential young adults to be successful in their careers, but more importantly in life. And then this most recent venture that I started up last year, called the Empower You program, which is all about first and second generation Asian Americans who are either immigrants themselves or their parents were immigrants, and they're really trying to figure out how this American system works and how they can kind of align their lives to be successful. And again, if I'm able to help them when they're in their 20s, this can help them for multiple generations going forward. And I've done a lot of things in this past 18 years to do a lot of one-on-one coaching, but then also organization building, to the point where I probably have, I don't know how many hundreds of people that I've mentored during this time. And by the way, when I mentor, I always say that I mentor for life, which means two different things. One is I'm mentoring them for for their life skills and so forth, but I never stop mentoring them. So when I take somebody under my wings to mentor them, I will continue coaching them as long as they continue asking for that. And so I have some people that I've been mentoring for 30 years. One of the people that I've mentored in China, he's now a CEO, and I'm still in contact with him. And so, yeah, a lot of what I've done has been, mentoring individuals. I'm starting to kind of change my mindset now, which is, taking what I've learned personally and what I've mentored and how I've helped coach people, and I'd really like to get it out to the masses, right? So, so if I'm able to help a classroom of 25, why should my impact be limited at 25? Is there a way for me to impact 250 people or 2,500 or 25,000 or 250,000? Can I go bigger with some of these lessons that I've learned and I've been able to teach? So that kind of occupies my mind right now. Is there a way to now get out some of these lessons in a much bigger and broader way to impact a lot more people? I haven't figured that out yet, but that occupies a real large part of my mind right now.
You know, with regard to the parts of your mind that this occupies, over the years,
Mhm.
I have received various out of the blue texts from you, and they're generally texts that come from this state of very deep existential contemplation. And you'll ask me a question, you know, as a therapist, what role do you see the healing aspects of music being able to play in the way that mental illness is healed in the larger community? And you know, I'm washing the dishes, I read a text like that and I go, man, Jim is in a different space right now.
Yeah,
I need to
exactly.
give this some thought and then get back to Jim a little bit later when I can focus up a little bit. You know, and then it launches into these wonderful kind of contemplative discussions that we have about just simply what is it that, how would you make music a thing that heals people who are suffering,
Yeah.
and how would you then expand that into a community thing that anybody can attend, because everybody deserves to have the gift of music in their heart for healing, for community, for connection, and everything like that. You spend time thinking about these deep issues, and I just kind of imagine you in your backyard looking at the stars, thinking about these things on a relatively free. Do you take time that is often for you to actually think these things through?
Um, I don't know if I dedicate time, right? So I don't like go to the beach and listen to the waves or anything like that. I don't meditate, right? But I do a lot of reading, I do a lot of thinking, and sparks of insight, you know, come up. The whole idea of being a serial social entrepreneur is very relevant here. And I'll give you an example, right? So I had this spark of insight, which is, you know, we're doing music programs, and we're at 43 elementary schools running these band programs, right? So we'll have about 1,300 kids as part of this program, right? So it's a big program. We started with 11, we're now 1,300 kids and all of that. But there's one school that we haven't gotten to, right? And it's called the Baker School, for kids with special needs. And I'm like, why aren't we doing something over there, right? Why can't we use music to impact these kids' lives who have special needs? So I start dabbling into this, and, you know, do some reading and research on it, and some approaches with it. But in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, so the first time we do it, it's going to be a pilot, right? But the second time we do it, we should start writing down what works. The third time we do it, we should start developing a curriculum. The fourth time, we should start taking this out to other different school districts and other different populations. And then the fifth time we do it, we should start, you know, broadcasting this nationally on some techniques that we use on how to do it, right? So the whole idea is, yeah, let's impact 12 kids now. Let's get to 160 at that point. But, you know, why can't we take some of these learnings and publish and develop to where we can impact the lives of, you know, thousands or tens of thousands of, you know, special needs kids, and impact their lives through music, right? So it really is this whole entrepreneurial approach to doing some things that would be of service, but doing it with more and more and having a bigger and bigger impact with this. Yeah. So this is it's a living one. That's an example right now that we actually just started talking about yesterday.
The focus that you have consistently worked on with me is focus on the message, focus on who you're helping, focus on the good that you are trying to affect in the world. Don't focus on the money, focus on the values.
Exactly. Right. And focus on stories, right? I'm a hoarder when it comes to stories. Uh, I'm not a hoarder in any other way, right? If you look at, I have 3 bookshelves behind me, right? In the past, these bookshelves were completely filled with books. I ended up giving away 95% of them. I think you can see just a few books over here, right? Those are important books to me, by the way. But I don't hoard anything else, right? I don't even hoard money or anything like that. But I hoard stories, because stories are those things where, if you're doing your things right, you can have these stories of impacting people's lives. And those are the best things to have, right? These stories are perfect examples of the good things that you've done in life that have had positive impacts. Yeah. So that's really what I focus on.
I want to ask you an even more personal question here, and it has to do with the role of fear and insecurity. And I know that, things that I have dealt with personally and things that a lot of people deal with is a fear of change, a fear of not measuring up, a sense of not being the whole imposter syndrome thing. And fear is a huge driver for people in making decisions that are filled with safety instead of values and everything like that. In your life, have there been times where fear and insecurity is something that you've had to overcome?
Not really. No, that fear is
That's the
not.
sense I'm getting.
It's not in my mindset, right? Um, I have this saying that runs in my mind, and it's something that I coach on as well. And the saying is, what's the worst thing that can happen to you? Right? So if you really think about that, right? If I take something on and it fails miserably, what's the worst thing that can happen to me? Not much, really. Right. Maybe I lose my job, maybe I lose some faith, I lose the time that I put into it. So what? I'm going to go and start something else. Right. And I coach people about this, right? So I coach a lot of really high level executives. I mean, CEO level executives. And when they're thinking about, risky ventures that they're going to take on or something that they're going to move forward with, I ask them, what's the worst thing that can happen here? Right. And for them, typically it's, well, they lose their job. That's the worst thing that can happen. And then so what? Right. Highly talented people, they can go on and get another job somewhere else, maybe even better than what they're currently at. And so that's something that, I coach people on that, and yet I don't need to really use that. I mean, some of the ventures that I'm involved with, what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, it fails miserably. Okay, fine. Let's redirect. Let's figure out what went wrong and let's make it better, or let's go do something else. Right. Yeah. So fear doesn't enter in my mind. And again, it gets back to the early stories of my ancestors. Right. They suffered from so much. They took risks to be here in the United States, and they succeeded, right? So what do I have to fear? Really nothing.
Well, in your discussions with people who are working with you about the role of fear and insecurity and everything like that, have you seen people severely or even partially limit their potential because they act based upon these kinds of things? And what has been your kind of takeaway from that sort of thing?
Yeah, I have. One of the things that I've employed in my management leadership style, I like to call myself a demand assist manager. So what that means is that I demand high performance out of the team that I'm leading, right? But I'm also very clear to say, I am ready to roll up my sleeves, right? And get in the trench with you. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and we're going to work together to make this initiative successful, right? And so what that does is it provides um, a level of focus towards excellence, but it also allows whoever I'm leading to know that I'm in their corner completely, right? And that I'm going to do everything in my power personally to help them to be successful with what they do. And so I think a lot of that provides assurance. I also tend to not be super critical. I'd rather focus on the positives than on the negatives, because I think if you're critical with somebody, it just puts this bug in their brains, right? This negative bug that's in their brains, and it holds them back from doing, from really moving forward as quickly and effectively as possible. And so I like to, promote and prop people up rather than cut them off and degrade them. And I think that's probably the most effective way to lead people.
And with regard to characteristics that a person can have that ends up being somebody who is limitless at a high level, what are those characteristics that you generally try to foster in a person, or that you see are a natural part of their just kind of personality?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is confidence, is helping people to understand where they've come from, where they're at now, and using that to build confidence, and to take small successes and make sure that you're celebrating those successes, because that's what gives you the confidence to move forward to the next bigger one, right? And I would say, back to the whole idea of helping leaders and helping them remove that break. That's the biggest thing. What I see in people is that they have a self-image of them that is really antiquated. And so a lot of people have a self-image of them when they are 5 years old or 8 years old, or, the youngest child being bullied by siblings or by, bullies at school, or, having critical parents or things like that. That's a lot of their own self-image is antiquated back when they were that young. Meanwhile, they've gone on to be successful in education and careers, and all of that, and yet their self-image is still stuck back when they were 8 or 9 years old. So what I do is try to help them to get a more updated sense of who they are. So a lot of coaching that I do, best thing that I can do is to be a perfect mirror to somebody, right? And to let them see themselves truthfully for who they are today. And when they see that, then in most cases they then update their own self-image and realize that, yeah, they are not who they used to be, but who they are right now. And that gives them a better sense of how to go forward.
You're doing therapy with people.
Is that what it is? I didn't even know that, right? And by the way, so I am not trained in soft skills at all, right? I took one psychology class when I was at Berkeley, and it was a pass-fail class, and I think I barely passed it. Right? So I am not trained in any of this in a formal sense. It really is kind of learning by doing.
What you're doing is so impactful, and I find this not only in myself, but in a lot of the clients that I am working with, this sense of not arrested development, but certainly this concept of self that goes back to many, many, many years ago, and a self concept that may include loneliness, isolation, feeling stupid, feeling alone, not feeling smart, these
Hmm.
sorts of things. And it can be very damaging, particularly the kind of modern education system that really adheres to a style of learning that is really good for certain kinds of minds and not that great for other kinds of minds. And so
Exactly.
younger
Yeah.
people can get a real mistaken sense of
Hmm.
what their actual value is. And they grow up with that, and they hang on to that. Even if
Hmm.
they get into high levels of things, they have to kind of unstick themselves from these earlier memories of themselves. And it can be really affecting for long periods of time.
Exactly. Yeah. It can carry on with them for their lives, right? A perfect example. So I was coaching this one woman. She was a middle manager at a large corporation, and it was our first one-on-one discussion. And she said, Jim, she said, I just want to let you know that I have a very horrible speech impediment. I've had it all of my life. This has gone and carried through with me all throughout my life. I remember back when I was in elementary school being teased so much that I would go home, running home crying because, I stuttered and I couldn't get my words out. Right? She said it exactly like I just did right now. And I said, you know what? Congratulations. Whatever speech impairment you had before, it's completely gone. You are so articulate now. So I said, from this point forward, you've been holding this ball and chain, and you've been carrying this 200-pound ball and chain around with you ever since you were that little girl back being teased. I said, from this day forward, we're going to cut that chain off, and you're going to leave that 200-pound ball behind. Right? Because whatever you have done in your life, you have now completely overcome that speech impediment that you had previously. It was so liberating for her, right? She went on about a month later, and she gave a talk at the state capitol in front of 400 girls with their moms, in front of this large audience, right? And was just amazing in her presentation, right? And to this day, she's now articulate. She no longer carries that ball and chain around with her, and she now has an updated sense of who she is. Um, so many people, if you can just release that brake, they're ready to soar, right? And that's a huge part of what I do.
How many people do you work with that have something like that kind of hanging on their shoulder?
Almost all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Almost all of them. Yeah. In whatever way, right? Um, and a good part of that is just like, hey, whatever you've had in the past, it's not working, right? Let's just figure out how to get rid of that so you can soar.
Yeah. That's incredibly insightful. And it was not that long ago, maybe a year ago, that you started doing a deep dive on the concept of moral injury
Mm,
as
mm,
a thing that I'll go ahead and attempt to explain it the best that I can. You can help
sure.
correct the idea of moral injury being a kind of psychological scar that is obtained when a person is asked to do things, perform functions, generally at a workplace, that is against their own internal set of values or feeling what is right. It is a concept that is heavily related to burnout
Hmm.
and happens quite frequently. And I've thought a lot about this since you started writing about it and talking about it, the concept
Yeah.
of moral injury. And I thought about the times in my life when I've been morally injured at work because I read a book that you may have read called Bullshit Jobs. And that book changed my life. It was about the concept of how many people have jobs where they don't actually do anything good for the world, where they're
Mm-hmm.
just clocking in, clocking out. The work is meaningless. It's not challenging. They're working with people they maybe don't like per se, and they're continuing to do it because there's some reward. It's the paycheck, it's the pension, it's the this, it's the that. So they continue on doing the work, even though there's really no purpose that they personally see in it. And it was not long after that I made some pretty strong changes in my own career. But you've done this research in this concept of burnout and moral injury, and you've been asking me throughout the year a number of questions about how would you work with this? How would you help people that are involved in this? Can you talk a little bit about this concept?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And again, this is one of those areas where it's just, I don't know how my mind was drawn to this topic, but what I saw was, especially during COVID, especially during, race protests, through things like, talking about defunding the police and first responders having issues and all that. I just kind of put two and two together and made 1,000, right? And to say that this is prevalent, it's all over the place. And I started seeing this in nursing and in education and law enforcement and in every place where you started seeing people who just wanted out, for whatever reason. And the whole idea of, you have this little boy who grows up wanting to be a police officer and sees the bright shiny car and this beautiful uniform and having the belt and all of that and helping people, right? Goes through and gets their education, goes to the academy, actually becomes a sworn police officer, and then people start talking about defunding the police and being afraid of police and being fearful for those who are there to really protect and serve the public, right? And so then you see these police officers who saying, why am I doing this? This isn't what I got into, right? This isn't why I got into police service. I chose to be in this to be in service to the public, and now the public sees me as an enemy, right? You see this in places like nursing, where the whole idea was to help their patients, to help the patients and the families, and being subjected to having to go to work in PPE and being sheltered and isolated from their patients, and causing during COVID having to shun the families from being able to see their very sick patients that are there, and having to assist these patients go through, in some cases, their transition into death, in loneliness, and nurses seeing this isn't what I signed up for. Teachers who feel unsupported and who had to go into work and kind of risk their lives even during COVID, and again saying this isn't what I signed up for, right? So really that whole sense of moral injury being prevalent in the workplace and in people's lives, and it was kind of misdiagnosed, right? People called it PTSD, or they called it burnout, and the whole idea of, what, yeah, they're burned out, let me send a bouquet of flowers to them, right? And that'll make them feel good, right? No, that's not it, right? It's not this Band-Aid solution to their moral injury. You really have to get back to where they are. Why did they choose this area of profession, or the work that they do? Because in some way that represented the values that they have in life, and you've got to get back to those values, which means understanding the stories, the success stories, having those really at the tip of your fingers, so that you can say, yes, I got into this profession to do good, and these are some examples of where I have really done good in my career and my life, right? And I want to do not one more of these, I want to do hundreds or thousands more of these, so that I can become this hoarder of these positive examples that are congruent and absolutely true with the values that I hold in my life. And by the way, this idea of doing jobs, that you're clocking in and clocking out, I've actually thought that you can find meaning in whatever job that you have. It doesn't matter what job you have, you can find meaning in that job. I've been tempted to almost go out and volunteer, like on a weekly basis, right? go and work at a fast food restaurant and work in the back and flipping burgers, I know that I can find meaning in that job. I don't know what it is, but it probably has to do with uplifting people that I work around, of being of service to others. Um, I I don't think it. I think I could find meaning in whatever job that I could find, and part of that might be, yeah, going around week by week and actually volunteering um, to do work and finding meaning and maybe writing up on what that meaning is in seemingly meaningless jobs, right? I do believe you can find meaning wherever you go.
I'm just trying to take this all in, quite honestly, because
Mhm.
we're living in this world right now that is so full of strife, and there's so full of anxiety and hatred and fear. And I certainly am seeing a lot of this in the people that I am treating right now, and relationships being affected by things that would have been trivial 40 years ago, but seem very, very present and weighty today because of the change of the lens of what is important today versus what was important, it seemed, about 40 years ago.
Mm.
And so I'm watching this world of people that seem highly, highly affected by things that maybe aren't as weighty as they make them themselves. Some of these issues are very important, and but also there's an assignment of meaning and severity to many of these things that
Mhm.
our society is dealing with right now, that
Yeah,
makes people.
give me an example of one of those, right?
So I'm talking
Yeah.
about in a polite way, our political landscape,
Okay.
the red versus blue, the social strife that has been present for very, very vividly for the past 3 years. A sense of, if this person votes for that person,
Mm.
then this person supports people I hate, and therefore this person is a bad person. And you focus really highly on the higher aspirations of a human being,
Mhm.
really far above the thing that I was just talking about. What effect are you seeing of the kind of overheated social, political, and class-based kind of dialogue that's going on right now in people? How are you seeing it affect people?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to let you know, right? I am not political.
Yes.
I I've been asked to run for office
Hmm.
a few times, right? I've always very politely said no, that's not for me. I have more personally within my family, I've told them, if I ever talk about running for political office, take me in the backyard and shoot me. Um, and there's a reason for that, right? Um, I I believe in being who I am, right? And I believe that um, uh, I am, you could argue I'm a pleaser in a lot of different ways. And I don't like the idea of almost 50% of people not liking you because of a letter that goes behind your name or a color that you're associated with, right? Um, in the grand scheme of things, that shouldn't matter, right? It's just that we're all here as people. And if my whole mission in life is to have a positive impact on everybody that I encounter, it really doesn't matter what your affiliation is. I'm here to have that positive impact with whoever I encounter. And so yeah, maybe I tend to stay up higher level, which then means that I'm not kind of in the fray of things. Um, and yet I do believe that there is a lot of room for um, a lot of just civil discussion and having containers that are there, safe containers for people to discuss feelings openly, right? And to share in a safe environment disparate views on things.
So where are you going from here? What are you doing?
So like I said, my focus is on that. I think I've acquired a lot of knowledge and experience, right? Through my first 18 years of education, my second year, 18 years of corporate life, my third 18 years of helping people and mentoring. And I think my next 18, is it my last 18? I don't know. Is really taking that and giving that away in a much bigger and a much broader way. So the things that I've done with individuals, being able to take that to, thousands of people at this point. I I developed this idea of I wanted to impact the lives of 1 million kids. And that million is really important because it causes you to do things in a different way, right? So for example, if I'm the drum corps director for the Mandarins, that means I get to impact 150 plus kids per year, right? So let's do the math, right? 1 million divided by 150 means that I would have to operate for 6,666 years to impact 1 million people. So I can't do that. I have to think bigger, right? I could think now to being on the board of directors for DCI, Drum Corps International. And in that case, impacting the lives of 5,000 kids. So now let's do that math. That means I'd have to do that for 200 years in order to impact 1 million people.
I hope you're taking
I'm getting
fish
closer. Yeah. So I'm getting closer, right? But still, I don't have 200 years to live. So what that means is I have to start impacting, I don't know, on the order of 100,000 people per year. And that just causes you to think differently. What that means is that I need to think in a more systematic way. I have to think about empowering others to impact the lives of others, and to really think in that bigger and broader way. One example is I call it my $1 trillion challenge for myself, right? And that's to create or to help create young people who can become millionaires in their lives. And if I can help 1 million young people to become millionaires in their lives, that's $1 trillion. You just do the math, right? So impacting $1 trillion of wealth that way. Not that I want to see any of it. Actually, I don't want any of it, right? I don't want my 1% or anything like that wealth managers take in. I don't want any of that. But what I want to do is to figure out how I can impact the lives of 1 million people to become millionaires in their lives, right? Just forces me to think a lot differently. So that's where my mind is right now, is now how to impact more people in bigger and broader ways. Don't know how to do it yet. So if you have any ideas, let me know. Right?
Yeah, I'm working on it too. So let's just talk about money for a second here. And sure. There's this Abrahamic kind of biblical concept that money is the root of all evil. I think that is a specific scripture among many that is really misinterpreted. Misunderstood in every single way, because obviously wonderful things happen based upon people who handle wealth in a positive way, for the positive reasons, for the right ways, and everything like that. So what is real wealth? What is sustainable wealth? And how is it that people should be thinking about money?
Yeah, wealth is time, right? Think about it. The thing that we all have a finite amount of is our time. That's it. And you can't buy time, right? So what wealth provides you with is the ability to use your time in whatever way you want, and to do the most and the best good. That's all it is. right? Um, to use wealth for bad things, or to hoard wealth, or to think that that's going to be the biggest driver in your life. No, wealth just, all it does is it buys you time. That's it, right? I had this opportunity. So after graduate school, I went to the University of Washington up in Seattle. I was highly recruited after graduating from this little company up in Washington called Microsoft. Okay. Little company at the
I've heard
time.
of it. Yeah.
You've heard of them, right? I was recruited to go there. And actually I went and I interviewed there, went for several on-site interviews at their headquarters. And I saw in the offices treadmills, stationary bicycles. One manager had a pull-out bed that was unmade in his office, right? And I said, "What's this all about?" And they said, the cafeteria is free, so you have all the food that you want for breakfast, lunch, dinner, however you want. You never have to leave here, right? So they were basically creating these people who would work, 80, 100, 120 hours a week. That fit directly with my personality. If I had joined Microsoft at that time, I would have been one of those workaholics and would have never left, right? My car would have never left the parking lot there. I would have been there with Bill Gates all that time. That was probably, some people can look at that and they can say, Jim, that was probably $100 million, maybe $1 billion mistake that you made by not taking that position, right? But I knew at that time I would not have been married. I would not have had my kids. I would have been a slave to the company, and my life trajectory would have been completely different, right? So I chose not to take that position, actually, and yet I still was able to make enough money in a fairly young age to be able to buy my freedom, which then allows me to go on and do bigger and better things. No regrets, right?
Yeah.
Maybe
Well,
I would have owned the Oakland A's at this point or something like that, right? But that wasn't my approach, right?
well, and you've made decisions that have allowed you to act based on your values and help the people that you feel most passionate about helping, and to have the freedom to move around in the world and do things that actually create a greater sense of health for you. You were looking at that decision based upon your just emotional long-term health. Do I want money or do I want children? Do I want a
Mhm.
family? Do I want to be a titan of industry that lives in an office?
Right. Yeah, and that was an early decision. I think I was probably, what, 22 years old at the time. And certainly the lure of going to this, great company that's, just starting out, the lure was definitely there. But yeah, I passed on that opportunity with no regrets.
So what I'd like to do now is, Jim, would you mind just talking directly to the viewer, to to the person who's watching this and who's been listening to all of this through? What is it that you would tell a person who is in their career trying to figure out where to go, maybe at the precipice of a major decision, or deciding where they want to go with their future? What is it that you would tell people as a guidepost for how to move forward in their lives?
Yeah. Sure, I'd be glad to. So my biggest piece of advice would be to know what is your long-term mission, right? What is your vision for your life, and how do you see your life actually ending up, right? Because that will put your 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 ultimate lighthouse, right? The direction that you go from here on out will be based on that. I use that example exercise of envisioning my own funeral, right? And sitting in the pew and looking behind me in the pews and seeing, were there 5 people, were there 50, were there 500 people there? how many people were there, who's there, who's missing, who's not there. And ultimately, as the open mic happens, what are they saying about your life? Because that's the legacy that you want to leave. um, and really grappling with that, understanding what is your life legacy and where do you want to go. Because then what happens after that is all of those life decisions that you make must be consistent with your life legacy. So in my case, right, if my whole idea is to have that positive impact on everybody that I encounter, what that means is that I'm forbidden by my own values of having a negative impact on somebody, which means that I can't lie, cheat, or steal with that person. I have to uplift them. I have to provide coaching. I have to provide value for their life because that's my life vision, right? And I have to stay consistent with that. So that'd be my recommendation is really understand to that deep level of where your life is going and what your life is going to mean, and then just make your actions and all of your decisions be consistent with that. I hope that helps.
It's super helpful, and everything that you've told me throughout the many years has been really helpful in making sure that I'm staying on track with what's real, as opposed to what's attractive and what's flashy. And that it's been really helpful to just have you in the background when I've called you at really pivotal times in my career. And it's this kind of advice that has really helped form and shape the decisions that I've made and the steps that I have made and the ways that I've recovered from things that have happened. And so just, on a personal level, thank you for always being there and your constant patience.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. I'm glad that I can be here for you. And I'm glad that I'm somebody that you'll call, right? Because as I say, I'm your mentor for life.
Well, I do feel really lucky for that. And I also wanted to just kind of clear a moment here for you to say anything that you had wanted to say here that perhaps you didn't get a chance to say.
Yeah, so as I think about things in a big way, right? I I I don't think in terms of the individual one-off situations. What I think about is how can we do things in a much bigger way? And certainly one of the things that's kind of weighing on my mind right now is our mental health crisis, right? And to see that uh, a big part of mental health issues come about from early childhood trauma, and to see what is it that we can do in a very, very big way, right? Um, to either cause trauma to not happen, to eliminate trauma early in life, to address it early, um, to free that ball and chain, but to address it in a very big way, right? So I know that trauma can be addressed and mental illness can be impacted on a one-on-one therapy basis, and that's a huge part of what you do. But I think about the millions of people who don't have access, and what can be done for them. I don't know the answer. I'm sure if there was a simple answer that was out there, it would be done already. But that's where my mind gravitates to. It's how do we help the hundreds of thousands of people in a very big way. I think of that even in terms of things like literacy, right? That literacy is combated a lot today on a one-on-one basis. You have an individual who's reading to a child and helping them to become literate. But is there a different dynamic? Is there a different way where we can address it for millions of kids at a time? So that's where my mind is right now. It's helping to be part of a solution to some very big challenges that we have in a very big way. Because I know that the individual one-on-one way while it helps that individual, doesn't help the masses.
We've gotten away in the way that our society is set up from the concept of strong communities. Those communities historically being the people that you live around. And we don't have that same connection to the people that we live around that we had in eons past. And that lack of connection and community is a lot of what creates what you're talking about here, this sense of, what is it at its core? A difficulty in belonging. Because a lot of those wounds that you are talking about, childhood wounds and these sorts of things, they are often corrected historically, going back, through a sense that you belong, just as you are. That you are okay the way that you are. You might be different. You might have what we call schizophrenia these days. You might just look different or be different in some way. But when you are accepted the way that you are, it goes a long way in just feeling okay. And there is a strong sense that there's a strong lack of community that's happening. There's a strong sense of focus on success and perfection as defined in a very specific kind of way. And that creates the kind of isolation that it pushes people into over-identifying with negative aspects of their life and their history, instead of being accepted and feeling a sense of forward momentum and feeling a true loving sense of community. Community is incredibly important for a human being. So when you're talking about the macro sense of what can we do to improve the lives of people in a big way, individual therapy and music and these various different things are definitely helpers of that, but community is critical in creating that. I know that you have done a lot in trying to create great communities.
Yes, I've tried, and yet there's small pockets, right? I just think that, where I'm at in my life right now, it's that I don't want to only deal with the ones or the tens, but really help in the thousands or the tens of thousands. And so that's where my mind is right now. And that's really this fundamental shift that I have in my mind. And it really is the 18-year cycles that I go. And it's very appropriate that last week was my 60th birthday, right? Because that triggers my next 18 going forward. And so that's where my mind is. And if it really is creating communities, then it's not creating a community of 10, but how do you create a community of thousands, or plant seeds where communities can be built with thousands and thousands of people? That's where my mind is going. And so I'm really thinking in terms of big and bold at this point. And that's where the whole idea of my title as a serial social entrepreneur comes about. Because now I know some of the problems and I know some of the solutions, but now how do you take that into a very, very big way?
Jim, thank you so much for being a part of this and for sharing your knowledge and your just base level wisdom in this. It's really appreciated by me and all of the people who are going to listen to this out there. I just really appreciate you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And stay tuned. I don't know if I'm going to come up with any solutions in my lifetime, but I'll be trying.
If you do, come back and we'll talk about it.
I'd be glad to. I'd love to.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Now go be something great.